Hello, everyone. Welcome to another lecture for History 3. Right now, let me start sharing my screen and I'll tell you what we are discussing. And please, anytime, if you have a question about any of this lecture, just contact me via email and we can set up a Zoom meeting or something. I'd love to listen to your wonderful voices and see your wonderful faces. Okay, I'm going to share my screen now. So the question we're going to be dealing with today is the Cuzco Convent. And my question is, what strikes you about the role of the Cuzco Convent in the Hispanicizing of mestizos? You can find this question right over, go ahead. Right here in the questions and materials, 4 big questions for Spanish invasion and settlement of the Americas. Scroll down, and it's this question here, under the big question number 2, the Incas. Okay, here is the question about the Cuzco Convent, and I will post it right here after the recording. All right, let's continue. So, in order not to be a hypocrite, I have to show you my sources because I'm making you cite your sources in your papers. Well, here's the source I'm going to be using. Catherine Burns in the 1980s was lucky enough to get access to the documents and archives of this convent, the Cuzco Convent in Cusco, Peru. And she wrote this book after her research. It's called Colonial Habits, Convents, and the Spiritual Economy of Cusco, Peru. So this is the source of today's lecture. I encourage you, if you're interested, to look into this more and ask me, and I'll let you borrow the book. Pardon me. So remember, the Spanish-American ideal, their ideal for colonizing and the infrastructure they hoped to create was that Spanish men would govern the colonies, Spanish priests would pray for the immortal soul of the converted, and Indians would do the work, quote unquote Indians, whether they're Maya up in Mexico or Inca down in Peru. And so the Spanish priest's job was to convert native people who they saw as heathens into Christians. And I can't emphasize enough the central role of the Christian church in Europe at the time. So the church based in Rome, who we now call the Catholic Church, but again, Catholic just means universal, was the #1 Western institution in the 1500s. They're the only place that offered orphanages, schools, hospitals, banks. They were far more than just a place to achieve salvation, right, and work on your spirituality. They're also on the ground working institutions. And this is why, one of the many reasons why Inés Suárez in the book you're reading helps found Our Lady of Perpetual Help Church in Santiago, Chile, Nuestra Señora de Socorro. And here it is today. And here's the patron, the Virgin Mary, patron saint of the Santiago Church. Some elite members of Inca or Aztec or Maya, some elite members who wanted to ally themselves with the Spanish did convert. Okay, and this goes also for Inca folks. Not many Mapuche converted, as we shall see. Most did not convert, however, and when some of them who pretended to convert were found continuing to practice their traditional religions, Spanish authorities cracked down. So yes, Spanish authorities did create the Spanish Inquisition, their version of it in the Americas, came down on Inca, Maya, and other native peoples. What mostly happened though, Spanish authorities did not have the power or the wherewithal to force all Native Americans to convert. So Spanish church authorities were pretty flexible. They allowed for a level of religious syncretism, which means the blending of one or more different religions. And this is the reality of what happened throughout the Americas, in our case, Peru. Here's an example of a religious parade through the streets of Cusco in the 2000s. And it mirrors a lot some of the practices that Inca people were practicing before the Spanish came, right? They're still wearing their traditional Inca outfits, right? And if you went to a mass in the Cuzco Cathedral here in the year 2000s and compared it to a mass you would have in Rome, it would be quite different. In other words, the religiosity or the Christianity practiced in Peru is much different than that practiced in Rome. So one of the awards, one of the things granted to the conquistadors, remember the Spanish crown did not pay the conquistadors to go conquer the Americas. The conquistadors paid out of their own pocket for weapons, for feeding their army, for supplies and everything else. So what the Spanish crown did in order to keep the Spanish conquistadors loyal was granted them indigenous land and labor. And this is the term, the encomienda is the Spanish term for this grant of indigenous land and labor. This is a super interesting bilingual, this one's from central Mexico, but the same policy went down in very similar ways in Peru as well. For example, this conquistador is awarded this big chunk of land. This is Coyoacan. You can tell because that's the glyph in the Mexica language for Coyoacan. A coyote, Coyoacan is a coyote, and here's the coyote on the head of this pyramid. And they're also granted the labor and the of the people living there, symbolized by this glyph right here. However, just as many American settlers came from Europe in order for opportunities and to, help their family and just to, improve their situation in the world, Spanish conquistadors came to the Americas in order to improve their place in the world, both economically, politically, and socially. So their form of how you hand stuff down was to the eldest son. So the Spanish conquistadors who came over and who were successful and were granted an encomienda by the crown could only hand down their encomienda to their eldest son. This is, the word for this is primogeniture, right? Your eldest son gets all the property, all the inheritance. And the idea behind this is if you split your inheritance into different siblings, different kids, then you're going to weaken your position, right? So primogeniture was the main way that Spanish society handed down wealth to one family member throughout the family, throughout generations. However, the issue in Peru, hold on, let me check this. Okay. However, the issue in Peru and also in central Mexico is that there's very few Spanish women the first 40, 50, 60 years. Very few Spanish women migrate to the Americas. Inez Suarez is an exception to that rule. So what ended up happening, Spanish men, whether by hook or by crook, ended up having concubines or having families with Inca women and with other native people, other native women. Here's a Woman Boma image showing you a Spanish guy wooing this Inca woman, and she's dancing and, right, she seems to like the rhythm of the Spanish guitar. So the result of this is that mestizas, people of mixed heritage, mixed Spanish, African, and indigenous heritage, were the fastest growing population of folks in the Americas, from Peru to Mexico. I mean, I'm talking about all the Americas in general. We're going to focus in on Peru in a second. And this is a very interesting painting. This is one of a series of hundreds of paintings that were done by Spanish authorities. And they were trying to categorize by who your parents were, where you fit in society. So on the upper left-hand side, we're seen as the highest ranking group of mixed people. And that would be a Spanish guy with an Indian woman would create a mestizo. Way down here was, right, a mixed person with an Indian person would create this person. You can tell they're very much much more impoverished. They're barefoot. Their social situation is nothing compared to the high-class situation of the upper left-hand image here. Pardon me. So since mestizos neither belong to the Native American groups, nor legally to Spaniards, they weren't officially Spaniards, as Isabel Allende said on page 79, these lands in the Americas are being peopled with resentful mestizos, because neither did they feel like they belonged in the traditional Native society or in this new highly segregated Spanish society. Here's an example of another of the casta paintings, as these came to be called, showing they're trying to, did I spell title? No. They're trying to like formulaically say where you belong based on who your parents are. So here's a Spanish man with the Spanish mom, a mulata, right? Mulata is a derogatory term the Spanish came up with to describe the person who's the offspring of a Spanish person and a African person. And their kid is called a morisca. This is totally what they say, a social construct. Biologically, these are all the same folks, right, related, but just because this segregation based on this newly invented thing of racism, right, puts you in the social hierarchy based on these made up terms in the 1500s. So let's get specific. That might have been kind of a broad, that was a broad introduction to this, but let me talk about one specific way this manifested in Cuzco, Peru, the capital of Peru. One Spanish conquistador by the name of Diego Maldonado, he was awarded an encomienda of land and people's labor. He was also awarded a lot of gold because he was part of the conquest and killing of Atahualpa. And he was awarded Atahualpa's sister. Now, being awarded Atahualpa's sister was quite an honor for the Spaniard because she still held in her family, right, a Manco Inca's family and Atahualpa's family still held a lot of political capital in Peru. Remember, there's just a few hundred Spaniards in Peru at this time, next to millions of native peoples. So the Spanish just couldn't come in and tell the native peoples what to do. They had to work with the existing political system. 9 months later, not surprisingly, Diego Maldonado and Atahualpa's sister had a mestiza daughter named Beatriz. And again, everything I'm telling you comes from Diego Maldonado's perspective, because unfortunately, Atahualpa's sister did not have a diary. We don't get her side of the story. So we have to kind of get at their side of the story by reading against the grain a bit, some of these sources. This one's called De Español y India produce mestizo. And again, this is not actually Diego Maldonado or Atahualpa's sister, but it's an image of a mestizo family, a painting of a mestizo family. However, since encomiendas are only handed down to legitimate kids, and legitimate kids are produced in the society by a married couple. Only if you're married was your kid considered legitimate, otherwise it was considered a bastard or illegitimate. And you could not hand down your wealth, or in this case, your encomienda, to your illegitimate kid. So the issue was, how do you make mestiza girls legitimate? And why wasn't it mestizos? Well, they really didn't care about the mestizo boys because there was plenty of Spanish men. There weren't enough Spanish women. So what they needed was to make mestizas Spanish women. And I'm going to tell you how they did this through the institution of the Convent of Santa Clara in Cuzco. So in 1551, Maldonado and his buddies created the Santa Clara Convent. Let me just get the dates straight. I'm not really big into dates. So in 1539, he was awarded Atahualpa's sister, okay? And a year after, about 1540, they had a kid, Beatriz. So by 1551, Beatriz is about 21 years old, right? This is a generation later. She's 21 years old and like, oh my gosh, what are we gonna do? So Diego Maldonado has no legitimate heirs. So he's going to create the Santa Clara Convent, right, in order to convert and civilize elite mestiza women. In other words, to legally turn mestizas into Spanish women. So 60 mestiza young women enter the convent of these wealthy and powerful conquistadors with a dowry that funded the convent. A dowry is something you usually bring with marriage, or aspiring nuns bring it when they enter a convent. Some mestizas, the majority actually in this convent, were kidnapped from their Inca families and brought to the convent in order to raise these mestiza kids who were growing up with their Inca families, turn them into Spanish women. So Spanish nuns traveled over from Spain to work at the convent, and they taught these mestiza girls the Spanish art of baking, cooking, the Spanish language. They could make empanadas, right? They taught Spanish mannerisms, how to sit at a table, how to use a knife and fork, etc., right? How to become ethnically Spanish women. This is what I mean by the word Hispanicizing. In the United States, we did something very similar. The Indian boarding schools was an attempt to turn Native Americans in North America into settler Americans. If you take my US history class, we discuss this quite in depth in assignment 1. So at maturity, right, when they were deemed by the Spanish nuns who ran the school to have graduated and learned enough about what it is to be a Spanish, some mestizas had the option to profess to be a nun. And if you decided to stay in the convent and live and work there, you literally, symbolically married Jesus in a very formal ritual in which the bishop or the priest oversees your marriage to Jesus. Or you left the convent. And if you left the convent, you were legally a Spaniard now. So your papers, they changed your papeles, your papers, and now you are Spanish, a Spanish person. And you could either work for a Spanish family as a servant, or you could marry a Spanish man because now you are legally a Spaniard. And when you married that Spanish man, the kids you had were now legally Spaniards. So now you could hand down, now conquistadors could hand down their encomienda and their wealth to a legitimate Spanish heir and not lose generational wealth. You might ask, why might some nuns decide to stay in the convent? Aspiring nuns stayed in the convent. Why wouldn't they want life outside the convent? Well, just to quote one famous Mexican feminist writer, historian, scientist, this woman from the 1640s, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, she famously wrote in a long poem, she preferred the bars of a convent, to the shackles of marriage. And marriage, literally, the word for marriage in Spanish is esposo. That's the name of the husband. Esposo is also the name of handcuffs. Right? Isn't that interesting? So if you want to look more into this witty writer, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, let me know and I'll share with you some of her writings. So some women did prefer to stay in the convent for whatever personal reasons. Maybe some felt like Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, she preferred the bars of the convent to the shackles of marriage. So back to Diego Maldonado's story. His mestiza daughter, Beatriz, was now legally Spanish. So now she could marry a Spanish man, because remember, there were plenty of Spanish men. She could marry a Spanish man, and their offspring, bam, were legitimate, and they were, his wealth was saved. The Santa Clara Convent is still around today. If you walk around downtown Cuzco, you can either check out the SpongeBob, whatever that is, You can cruise the Cathedral of Cuzco, Peru, right? And go visit it. Oh gosh, I'd love to visit it. Once this COVID thing's over, I can't wait for my field trips with students to Latin America to continue. I love those. All right, I'm gonna go now. Enough for me. Please, if you have a question about any of this, I love to talk about it, whether we do it through Zoom or whether we do it through email or phone call. Please get in touch with me.